Today it seems as if Titanic is everywhere. Her image has grown into a pop culture icon. And her story has inspired fanaticism the world over. Titanic has appeared in every form of mass media of the 20th century. From books, songs, plays, and CD-ROMs to the most successful film of all time. It's as if she never left our imagination. From the moment she disappeared beneath the icy waters of the North Atlantic, her story has captivated the public as no event in history. From the first headlines to the earliest films, Titanic is a part of our collective consciousness. And no generation has been immune to her power. It is a story that has been reinvented as everything from melodrama to Nazi propaganda to legends of courage and sacrifice. And the discovery of her wreck in 1985 has only helped fuel the ongoing fascination with the events of Titanic. But it has been the stories of the 1,500 who perished, and the voices of the 700 who survived that continue to inspire artists throughout the 20th century, turning the tragic events of one night into a cultural phenomenon of mythic proportions. On the evening of April 14, 1912, a desperate plea for help crackled through the frigid night air over the North Atlantic. The world's greatest ocean liner was sinking. A dozen ships heard the frantic message. Some were too far away to do anything. Others couldn't believe the mighty Titanic was really in trouble. Harold Cottam, the wireless operator aboard a small steamship, Carpathia, waiting for news from the mainland, accidentally heard the cry for help. Tearing the headphones from his ears, he rushed to the captain's cabin with the news. Within minutes, the Carpathia had changed her course and was racing at top speed through the same ice-filled waters that had crippled Titanic. 58 miles of open sea separated the Carpathia and the sinking ship. Every ounce of power was redirected to the ship's engines. As the sun crept over the ocean's horizon a few hours later, the passengers and crew of the Carpathia realized the worst. Titanic was gone. A handful of half-filled lifeboats were bobbing in the vast expanse of frigid sea. The only evidence of what was hours before, the most luxurious ship ever built. For 4 long, somber days, the Carpathia steamed for New York City with 705 Titanic survivors on board. Wireless reports cracked through the icy air. The first reports to reach the city touched off a firestorm of speculation. News writers, desperate for copy, wrote stories based on scraps of information. Initial coverage of the event varied from hopeful to forlorn to grossly inaccurate. The Evening Sun was optimistic. Other papers were more guarded.
One of the more astonishing things about newspaper coverage of the disaster is that there were these kind of elaborate stories told even before there was any reliable information. In the first couple days after the disaster, all that the news organizations had to go on were lists of who had lived and who had died, but they have to give their readers more than that.
Nobody wanted to believe the worst in the case of the Titanic. There wasn't conclusive wireless information that the ship had gone under.
At the New York offices of the White Star Line, the owners of Titanic, anxious crowds gathered, desperate for information. Lists of the survivors were posted on the front window, bringing shouts of joy from some and cries of agony to others. Even before the Carpathia could reach her destination, journalists vied to be the first to get the full story from the ship's passengers.
To give you an idea of the frenzy that had overtaken the New York press, a number of reporters got together, chartered a boat to sail out into the channel to meet the Carpathia, and they were standing on the decks and they were shouting questions up at the passengers and crewmen. Some of them were waving $50 and $100 bills to get them to literally jump off the Carpathia so they could be picked up by the press boat.
When the Carpathia returned to New York with the 705 survivors, nearly 30,000 people lined Pier 54 for a glimpse of those who had beaten the North Atlantic. What for 4 days had been a silent list of names would finally become flesh and blood. There were touching stories, and the world wanted to know them all. There were heroes. Benjamin Guggenheim, who went down a gentleman in his white tie and tails, declaring that no woman shall be left aboard this ship because Ben Guggenheim was a coward. Ida Strauss, who stepped out of her lifeboat and back onto the Titanic to stay with her husband of 31 years. And the unsinkable Molly Brown, a member of the Nouveau Riche, who fought to let the women in her lifeboat row in order that they stay warm. Desperate for an exclusive scoop on the stories of bravery, a New York Times reporter paid Harold Bride, the surviving wireless operator, $1,000, equivalent to 4 years' pay, for his eyewitness account of the harrowing night. But not all were stories of heroism. Along with tales of bravery were rumors of desperation, cowardice, and negligence. Questions were left unanswered.
People could not believe that this had happened. People had a hard time fathoming death on this scale, of this magnitude, in 1912. And of course, people were trying to fathom how on earth can something made out of ice sink a ship made out of steel? And people began to ask very, very pointed questions. Who's to blame? Who's responsible? And how can we not let this happen again?
The day Carpathia docked, U.S. Senator William Alden Smith detained several passengers and crew for questioning, many of whom were hastily attempting to return to British soil. The next day, April 19th, Senator Smith quickly convened a special hearing inside a large meeting hall at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in New York City to discover the truth of what happened that night. Outside the meeting hall, hundreds of curious New Yorkers gathered, hoping to hear first-hand accounts of the tragedy, or to catch sight of one of the infamous survivors. For 2 weeks, newspapers across the country devoted entire sections to the hearings. Readers were fascinated by every bit of the shocking testimony.
Much of the behavior of the people on the Titanic was presented for the first time and in tremendous detail in this investigation. It's one of the best sources that we have about what actually happened on board the Titanic the night she went down.
Sensational tales of passengers facing death were splashed across the headlines. There were unproven reports of gunfire in the ship's final moments as people rushed for the last lifeboats. These reports, however, were eclipsed by J. Bruce Ismay's account of the sinking. With the public desperate for a villain on which to lay blame, Ismay became the unwitting scapegoat for many. While other men stood back and let women and children into boats, Ismay, the managing director of the White Star Line, took a seat that both saved his life and ruined his reputation.
In 1912, the accepted standard of behavior for a man was very simple. He was expected to die rather than save himself and be looked upon as a coward.
Each account at the hearings added to the growing confusion as to what transpired that fateful night. While some testified that the ship went down intact, others reported seeing the ship break in two. A young survivor, Jack Thayer Jr., had a sketch made of how he watched the Titanic break as it sank beneath the surface of the Atlantic. Insulted by the American inquiry, the White Star Line refused to accept these reports, insisting that the ship was solid and went down in one piece. A month later, a British hearing was held. Though kinder to those responsible, both hearings reached similar conclusions. In the end, though, Titanic's Captain Smith was found negligent in his duties. Titanic was traveling too fast, considering the heavy ice reported in the area. The hearings also focused public attention on antiquated shipping regulations that allowed Titanic to sail with too few lifeboats for her passengers and crew. The accounts of why Titanic sank explained away some of the mystery, but the legend of the grand ship had been born. With the help of the new medium of motion pictures, Titanic was about to evolve from the greatest luxury liner of her day into a phenomenon far larger than any ship of dreams. It was 1912, the heart of the industrial age, a time of high ideals and higher hopes. Nothing seemed beyond our grasp. And yet Titanic, the greatest technological triumph of her time, sank on her maiden voyage, taking over 1,500 passengers with her. It was a tragedy that shocked the world. And while the American and British inquiries shed some light on the sinking, the public began to look for deeper meaning in the wreck. On every street corner of America, Titanic was the topic of conversation, and everyone had an opinion about the disaster.
For your average man on the street, it was very simple. This was, if not a heaven-sent warning, then at the very least it was a sharp reminder that fallibility was still the lot of mankind. That progress and technology and science were not inherently good things, but may present problems.
Pulpits across the country began ringing out the lessons of Titanic in sermons of condemnation.
Arrogance and hubris became the major theme of sermons the Sunday after the disaster. Almost every church in the country had some sermon about how we were defying the laws of God.
Reputedly, it was said, as the Titanic was being built, that God himself could not sink this ship. When the ship actually went down, people were aghast. How could a God, a Christian God, allow such a thing to happen? So a blasphemy of the time is that God went down with the Titanic.
Titanic also added fuel to the battle of the sexes.
After the disaster, one of the major themes was what all this had to say about the relationship between men and women, and specifically the rule of the sea, women and children first, that supposedly prevailed on the Titanic, suggested to people who were opposed to equal rights for women that women were better off entrusting themselves to the protection of men because the Titanic seemed to bear it out.
While anti-suffragettes saw the sacrifice as evidence that women should put their faith and their vote in the hands of their husbands, for women seeking equality, Titanic offered another lesson.
The idea of women and children first wasn't just a policy, it was an outgrowth of the Edwardian mentality. It ran into some flack afterwards because 1912 was one of the early peaks of the women's suffrage movement. There were some women who went so far as to say that it was the obligation of the women on board the Titanic to refuse to get into lifeboats unless the men were allowed to accompany them, all of course in the name of equality.
The African American community took its own messages from the shipwreck. One of the most popular interpretations of the disaster came from legendary singer-songwriter Huddie Ledbetter, known as Leadbelly. He put an ironic twist on the tragedy in his ballad, "The Titanic."
The most interesting thing about the Lead Belly song is the verse that goes, Jack Johnson wanted to get on board, Captain said, I ain't hauling no coal. Jack Johnson was the African-American heavyweight champ of the world at the time of the disaster. And he had tried to book passage on a transatlantic liner and had been denied because he was black. But Lead Belly took that story, put it on board the Titanic, and turned the disaster into a story about how Jack Johnson lived because he wasn't allowed on board the ship.
Jack Johnson wanted to get on board. Captain, he says, I ain't hauling no coal. Found the Titanic fairly well. Jack Johnson wanted to get on board. Captain, he says, I ain't hauling no coal. Found the Titanic fairly well.
Other artists also found the subject of Titanic irresistible, and amateur poets submitted odes and ballads to every newspaper in the country, expressing deep feelings evoked by the tragedy. Publishers, eager to make $1 on the frenzied interest, enticed survivors to pen their harrowing tales. Pictures from the doomed ship were worth more than 1,000 words. Most prized were these photographs, taken by Francis Brown, a passenger who fortunately disembarked Titanic in Queenstown, Ireland.
When he got off the ship, he didn't think they were particularly valuable. And after the news of the disaster reached Ireland, he discovered that this was a gold mine, that he had lots of journalists and newspaper editors started getting in touch with him, even from across the Atlantic. He did make a lot of money, especially at that time.
Perhaps the most compelling medium to present the Titanic story was that of motion pictures. Rarely running over 10 minutes, these flickering images brought news of the day alive as no other art form could. Recognizing the popularity of Titanic, pioneering filmmakers were drawn to the growing legend of the ship, eager to exploit the nation's fixation on the disaster. Within weeks of the tragedy, Nickelodeons lured audiences into theaters for a chance to see the great ship. For 10 cents a seat, people flocked to see newsreels of Captain Smith inspecting the notorious lifeboats. Of the famed Titanic waifs, Lolo and Lump Navratil, whose father died on the ship. Of any and all things Titanic. While these newsreels were limited to available footage, only 29 days after the sinking, the Eclair Film Company presented the first dramatic retelling of the Titanic tragedy, Saved from the Titanic. The film had the added attraction of starring one of the Titanic survivors, Dorothy Gibson, a well-known actress of the day. Gibson also helped write the script for the film based on her own experiences aboard the ship. Wearing the same dress she wore on that fateful night, Gibson gave an air of authenticity to this otherwise melodramatic film. Presumably lost forever, the only evidence of the film are these rare photos.
Saved from the Titanic was an attempt to capitalize on the intense public interest in the Titanic disaster to promote her career and, of course, promote this film. It certainly was an excellent example of how the Titanic disaster was exploited to further some people's careers.
The obsession with Titanic was not only an American phenomenon. That same year, a German production, Night and Ice, told the tale to European moviegoers. Lost for decades and perhaps never seen by American audiences, the film surfaced in 1998 when a German collector found it in his vault. Nearly 3 times the length of most films of the day, Night and Ice attempted to give viewers first-hand experiences of sailing on the famous ship. All of the Titanic stories came alive. Captain Smith could be seen on the bridge of Titanic as she neared the fatal iceberg. In the safety of the darkened theater, audiences could relive the terror and tragedy of the wreck. Audiences witnessed the selfless sense of duty displayed by the senior wireless operator, Jack Phillips, who had stayed at his post until the ship sank. And while the special effects may seem primitive, this was a true story, and audiences of 1912 found the film spellbinding. But while Night and Ice recreated the real event, another film used the sinking as a backdrop for its human drama. Atlantis, produced in 1913 in Denmark, was one of the first full-length films ever made. It was also one of the first films to seize on the theme of the class division that existed in Europe and on the decks of Titanic. Set aboard a ship sailing for America, the film told the story of a doctor whose amorous attention was divided between two women, one an immigrant in third class. The other, a rich actress. By creating a fictional tale, the 113-minute film allowed audiences to be swept up with the personal struggles of the characters aboard the ship. But when the luxury liner strikes an unseen object in the middle of the ocean, the sequences that followed were eerie echoes of the Titanic tragedy. Atlantis also boasted some of the most expensive and realistic special effects of the day. Where models had been used in previous films, Atlantis used a real ship for the climactic sinking scene, lending an air of realism that was often missing from earlier productions. Playing to packed houses around the world, the film was a huge hit, proving that the tale of Titanic was universal. But with the winds of war blowing in Europe, it would take more than 15 years before the Titanic tale would resurface again. When the First World War exploded across Europe in 1914, the shock of the Titanic disaster quickly faded away. News of trench warfare, mechanized battle, and chemical death filled the headlines of the world's newspapers, offering a grim portrait of the Industrial Revolution. If the sinking of Titanic signaled the impending death of the grand Edwardian era, the war to end all wars was clearly its funeral.
But the Titanic disaster showed some of the weaknesses of the society that eventually would crumble in the First World War. It was the flash of the cannon on the horizon. It was the rumble of thunder in the distance that let people know that what they believed to be so solid and so secure, so immutable, was nowhere near as stable as they wanted to think it was.
Titanic survivors, once the darlings of the media, faded quickly from the headlines. But the tragedy had left its mark on every one of them. Molly Brown, the Colorado millionaire, gained notoriety when she presented tokens of her appreciation to Captain Rostron and other members of the Carpathia crew who had saved her life. She also established a fund to aid Titanic survivors who had been left destitute following the wreck. Others were anxious to forget the events of that fateful night entirely, including Titanic's heroic wireless operator, Harold Bride.
He resigned from the Marconi Company and, for all practical purposes, vanished off the face of the earth. He never tried to make a name for himself or even let on that the Harold Bride, who was the traveling salesman, was the Harold Bride who was the junior wireless operator on Titanic.
The harshest judgment came to J. Bruce Ismay, whose very survival became an embarrassment he would carry with him the rest of his life.
IMM not only forced him off the board of directors, but they also forced him out as the chairman of the White Star Line. He was no longer welcome among polite society, ruthlessly ignored and cut by people who had been his friends. People would actually talk behind his back as he walked down the street. That's Ismay. They were whispering that he was a coward because that was how he was perceived.
In the post-war years, advances in motion pictures were luring larger audiences into theaters. And the invention of sound allowed filmmakers to present their stories more dramatically to the public. In 1929, the first talkie inspired by Titanic appeared. Titled Atlantic and based on the successful stage play by Ernest Raymond, the film presented the story of a presumably unsinkable ship that struck an iceberg.
And the emergency dynamos! And the emergency dynamos! And the emergency dynamos!
The film used facts, culled from eyewitness testimony, to portray every aspect of Titanic's sinking with an almost documentary realism.
Wait order! Wait order!
The film told of sacrifice, heroism, and the stoicism of some of the world's richest men trapped on board the doomed ship.
If you still love your wife and daughter, you'd better get them to the boats without delay.
Why? The ship's quite safe?
Oh,
Isn't it?
Yes. For a couple of hours?
The film also helped to establish some questionable Titanic lore, including which song the ship's band played as the liner sank from sight.
The debate goes on about what was the last piece of music played by the band. Was it Nearer My God to Thee? Was it the Episcopal hymn Autumn? Was it the popular waltz, The Song of Autumn? People are going to debate this for years. At the same time, legends sometimes obscure more important aspects of the story. Is it really important what the last piece of music played by the band was? No. What's important is that the band played until the waves washed them off the deck. But sometimes that's what legends are. The incidents that we make larger than life.
Atlantic explored every known detail of Titanic's sinking, and not surprisingly, brought condemnation from the owners of the White Star Line, who wanted the memory of Titanic to fade from the public's consciousness. Shortly after the film was released, the stock market crashed, sending America into a deep depression. In this time of crisis, Titanic became something of a modern myth, a metaphor for looming disaster and lost hope. In 1933, Titanic made an unexpected appearance in Noel Coward's Cavalcade, serving as an ironic warning for all who sail blindly toward the future.
This is our moment, complete and heavenly. I'm not afraid of anything. This is our own, forever.
In 1941, Germany's Minister of Propaganda, Joseph Goebbels, would use the story of the ship as a weapon against the Allies.
The first film ever made actually called Titanic was made in Germany during the war. It was the idea of Joseph Goebbels. He thought it would be a lavish escapist spectacle, which would also be a good vehicle for anti-British propaganda.
Goebbels and the Third Reich portrayed Titanic as a symbol of Britain's preoccupation with ostentation and greed. The White Star director, J. Bruce Ismay, eager to flaunt the crowning jewel of his luxury fleet of ships, recklessly guides Titanic into dangerous waters in an attempt to break all speed records. The ship's British captain is easily persuaded.
Im Falle der programmmäßigen Ankunft in New York zahle ich Ihnen $5.000. Und für jede Stunde, die wir früher eintreffen sollten, nochmals je $1.000. Also je höher die Geschwindigkeit Ihres Schiffes, umso höher Ihre Prämie.
But a fictitious German first officer refuses to be influenced by Ismay's bribes.
Herr Kapitän, es liegen mehrere Warnungen über Treibeisgefahr vor. Es sind auch Eisberge gemeldet.
So, welche Maßnahmen haben Sie getroffen?
Ich habe den Kurs entsprechend geändert und die Geschwindigkeit herabsetzen lassen.
Aber warum denn? Sie werden wohl noch einen Eisberg rechtzeitig erkennen können.
Verzeihung, Herr Präsident, aber das ist ein Irrtum. Es gibt Eisberge, die einen Umfang von mehreren Kilometern haben und 7/8 eines solchen Berges liegen immer unter Wasser. Es besteht also die Gefahr, auf Unterwassereis aufzulaufen.
Gefahr für die Titanic? Ist ja lächerlich. Die Titanic ist unsinkbar.
Der Beweis ist noch nicht erbracht, Herr Präsident.
Ich verlange, dass direkt der Kurs mit voller Kraft weitergefahren wird, Herr Kapitän.
The film also provided its own answer to the lingering question of how Ismay may have made his way into a lifeboat.
Ich verlange einen Platz im Boot, Captain Smith. Ich verlange einen Platz! Haben Sie mich verstanden?
Schreien Sie nicht so, Herr Ismay. Ich werde dafür Sorge tragen, dass Sie gerettet werden.
Wirklich?
Ja, aber nicht, um Ihnen einen Dienst zu erweisen, sondern damit Sie sich vor dem Seeamt dafür verantworten können, was Sie angerichtet haben. Bitte. Bitte!
Although the film was clearly a propaganda device, it created a thrilling recreation of the sinking. And gave audiences some touching moments. Ironically, the film's director, Herbert Selpin, like many artists in Germany, ultimately found himself clashing with the Nazi government. And after insulting the Third Reich, Selpin's career came to an abrupt end.
Goebbels summoned Selpin for an audience. Selpin did not recant. He was imprisoned, and as it came out after the war, forced to hang himself by prison guards.
By the time Titanic was released in 1943, massive bombing raids were closing theaters all over Germany, rendering Goebbels' propaganda weapon powerless. When World War II ended in 1945, there seemed to be little left to be said about the Titanic. 2 world wars and more than 30 years had passed since the tragedy. Survivors were lost, and even the White Star Line had gone out of business. Although her remarkable tale had served as a lesson for many, Titanic would fade from memory until her tragic story surfaced again, this time in Hollywood.
Four decades have passed since the Titanic screamed across the headlines of the world. Yet no human drama has eclipsed its staggering impact and overwhelming power. Now, for the first time, the screen brings you the strange events, the monumental story of those 4 never-to-be-forgotten days.
On April 14th, 1953, 41 years to the day after the Titanic tragedy, 20th Century Fox released the first Hollywood film about the ill-fated voyage, Titanic, starring Clifton Webb, Barbara Stanwyck, and Robert Wagner. It offered a new view of the disaster as a lavish backdrop for drama and a vehicle for the story of a family in crisis.
Richard, please try to see this sanely. We're Americans. We belong in America. And yet for years we've been galloping all over Europe to be at the proper places at the proper time. Winter in San Moritz, Deauville in season, summer in... Oh, what's the use? The same silly calendar year after year. Look at Annette.
I have, with great pride. She's entertaining, she's discriminating, she has grace and style.
She's an arrogant little prig.
So you've chosen to drag her back to the glories of Mackinac, Michigan.
Any town in any state becomes comic on your lips. But comic or not, that's where she's going.
De-emphasizing the factual events, Titanic explored a more intimate and at times even light-hearted view of the ship's passengers.
Shake your moccasins and roll your eye. Tear my blanket, make my feathers fly. Whirl me, twirl me. Whirl me, twirl me to that Navajo rag.
But it was a frank and contemporary drama that remained the focus of this retelling of Titanic's voyage.
We'll discuss it later.
Now. No court in the world, no power under heaven can force me to give up my son.
He is not your son.
You have a lot of utterly fictitious characters among passengers and crew, some glaring historical accuracies. There's even one scene where the port side of the ship is being opened up by the iceberg, when of course everyone knows it was the starboard side.
Did we hit it? It hit us.
At the same time, it can be a very emotional and very evocative film, but it did not center around the Titanic. The Titanic was, if you will, the vehicle.
It's almost 10:30, Father. We should have a warm-up. This may be a tough match.
You'll have to find someone else, Norman. I'm busy.
Yes, sir.
With America increasingly fearful of the atomic threat, Titanic gave audiences the message that traditional values were more important than ever.
That summer, when I asked you to marry me, I pledged my eternal devotion. I would consider it a great favor, Julia, if you would accept a restatement of that pledge.
The disaster becomes a way by which a man redeems himself and human conflicts are repaired.
Well, whatever happens, I love you very much. I've been proud of you every day of your life. Never as much as at this moment.
With the Korean War still fresh on everyone's minds, the loss of husbands and sons took on a special poignancy. Titanic touched and terrified audiences around the world, but the film left many unsatisfied, hungry for a more accurate retelling of the Titanic story. One such person was Walter Lord, an advertising copywriter and novice historian whose passion for Titanic began as a boy when he sailed aboard her sister ship, Olympic. For nearly 20 years, Lord had meticulously researched the Titanic and the story of the passengers who sailed her.
Walter Lord was the first Titanic author to systematically interview Titanic survivors. He interviewed 63 of them. He had the good fortune of having so many of them still be alive at the time that he decided to write this book. But what that did was give him a level of credibility that it would be virtually impossible to match anymore.
It was difficult in a way because there was no Survivors Association at the time. There was no Titanic Club. There was no Titanic interest, really. It was a challenge just to find them.
Published in 1955, A Night to Remember quickly climbed to the top of the bestseller lists, where it would remain for months.
Walter Lord wrote about how the Titanic represented the end of an era, how a beautiful way of life died that night in April of 1912, how before the Titanic disaster, people were confident, they had faith in the future, they had certainty. Afterwards, basically the modern world came upon us and everybody was filled with doubt. That has a kind of poetic truth to it that's really touched a lot of people.
The true story of Titanic was far more compelling than any Hollywood could invent. However, the next Titanic film wouldn't originate in Hollywood, but in Ireland, the birthplace of the great ship. Shortly after A Night to Remember was published, William McQuitty, a Belfast-born film producer, quickly began making plans to bring Walter Lord's story to the big screen.
No film can be better than its script. And here was a ready-made drama. He'd researched it for 20 years. It had everything I needed.
Unlike Hollywood's take on the disaster, McQuitty's film would focus almost entirely on the real events and characters of the ship. Lord was brought in as a consultant, and McQuitty made sure he stayed true to the book. doing everything he could to recreate the splendor and opulence of the Titanic.
I was so lucky. Bill was really interested in the Titanic. He really adopted the project as his own and was there all the time. The thing that interested me the most was how earnest he was in getting it absolutely accurate as far as he could.
For actor David McCallum, portraying wireless operator Harold Bride, boarding the replica of the ship every day was a heady experience.
I think the most vivid memory I have of making A Night to Remember was driving out to Pinewood Studios late afternoon to do the night work. You drive up onto the back lot, and as I came round the corner of one of the studios, right there on the horizon was the whole of the Titanic, or a huge center section of the Titanic, against the skyline, fully lit, with the smoke coming out of the funnels, and it really was like coming across the Titanic in the middle of the night.
A Night to Remember premiered in London on July 3, 1958, where it quickly became the most successful film of that year.
The 14th of April, 1912. A night to remember. A night when the largest, most luxurious liner of her day was speeding across the North Atlantic on her maiden voyage. No expense had been spared to make this ship a symbol of man's final victory over nature. The ship was called the Titanic.
What did you see?
Iceberg, get ahead, sir!
Cast as crewman Frederick Fleet, who first spotted the iceberg, actor Bernard Fox found the ambitious film's take on the disaster refreshing.
It was purely about the Titanic, which, from my point of view, is what I enjoy about it. You actually got to meet the people involved, knew who they were.
We've contacted the Carpathia, eastbound from New York. She's on her way to us.
Well, how far away is she?
58 miles, sir. She's making all possible speed. Should reach us in 4 hours.
4 hours.
Yes, sir.
Being there on the Titanic and taking a message to the captain as the radio officer, the reality of it was just like you were actually there, was quite, I mean, it was so exciting.
Captain, aren't you exaggerating the danger?
I'm afraid not, sir.
Where's Andrews?
I'm acting on his advice. This ship is going to founder.
But she can't. In any case, we can't get everyone in the boats.
I know that, sir. Please God, it won't come to that.
A Night to Remember deals almost exclusively with real historical characters, and because it doesn't really engage in a main romantic plot, it's able to make its way all over the ship in a fairly short amount of time, and to really get at a lot of different experiences of what it must have been like that night.
I say, let's go down and join the fun.
They're steerage passengers.
Mr. Guggenheim, your light bill. It was uncomfortable. We have dressed now in our best and are prepared to go down like gentlemen.
That is so, sir.
But surely, if anything should happen to me, I would like my wife to know that I behaved decently.